So we're going to try something different, guys. Instead of me standing in class and lecturing, we're going to try it this way, okay? So these are the chapter 3 and 11 lecture slides that you can find in Canvas. We've got a lot to cover, and I thought it would be a better use of our class time if we talked about things rather than sat through a lecture, okay? So the first part we're going to cover is chapter 3, which deals with evolution, biodiversity, and population ecology. So those are our goals for today. The big things here, efforts and challenges in biodiversity conservation and evolution influencing biodiversity. This stuff too. This is stuff you probably learned in biology. This isn't the case study that we're going to talk about in this chapter. But it talks about the fact that the first part of this talks about the fact that a lot of Hawaii's native birds have gone extinct since Hawaii was really colonized by man rather than the natives that live there. And there's an example, the Aki, which is a Hawaiian honey creeper. It has a very specific bill, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then that causes, when the preferred food source for this bird disappears because of humans, then their population declines also. So we know what a species is. If you don't, this is the definition. A classification of organism whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So you know a donkey and a horse are not the same species because their offspring, the mule, is infertile. Okay, you only get the only way you get a mule is from breeding a donkey and a horse. You don't get mules from mules. Okay. Population is a group of individuals within the same species that live in the same area. So you can talk about the deer population of Hunterdon County or the black bear population in New Jersey. Okay. It's a specific area and a specific group of individuals. You guys talked about evolution in your biology class, so we're not gonna dwell on it too much. This is the survival of the fittest thing that you guys might have heard of. Organisms are always struggling to survive. Individuals of a species can have different attributes, and you can look at the human species and see that. And then organisms with those traits that allow them to survive and reproduce are going to survive and reproduce and pass those genes on. Okay. We know that was Darwin and then Russell. Darwin's the one we know most about. And we know that you get your genes from your parents. Attributes, characteristics are passed from parent to offspring through genes. And eventually, those genes that stay in the gene pool that help the organism or the species survive, traits will disappear and new traits will come in, and that's called adaptation. Okay. There are accidental changes in DNA called mutations, which give more genetic variation in a group of individuals. And sexual reproduction takes those mutations and those variations, and through crossing over in prophase 1 of meiosis 1, flashback, and through independent assortment when they line up in prophase 1, and through the random fertilization of eggs and sperm. It's not, like egg 712 always has to go with sperm 1,823,000. Okay. It's completely random, all of that. That provides so much variation in a species. And depending on the environment, the environment can exert what they call a selective pressure on a species. So depending on the flowers in the environment or the food supply in the environment, that can shift the direction of a particular trait. Like in this case, the beak size of the iiwi, that's how it's pronounced. And there's selective pressure, okay? So all of these birds, these are the Hawaiian honey creepers, they were a single organism, a single species. Then they wound up in different areas of the island, and different areas of the island have different food sources available. So some of them developed the short, strong beaks to eat seeds and fruit. Others of them developed these really long beaks to eat nectar out of like the trumpet-like flowers that are really common in Hawaii. And then everything in between. Sometimes different organisms from completely different species can acquire similar traits. That's called convergent evolution. You don't need to know that. We have performed something called artificial selection. So if you look at all of the dog species on the planet, from Chihuahua to St. Bernard to Great Dane, they're all the same species. Okay. We've just selectively bred them to have particular characteristics. So we've done artificial selection. And this is also crazy. Okay. This is a mustard, Brassica oleracea, something like that, is an ancient mustard. And from that, we've gotten cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and cauliflower. They're all related. Excuse me. Evolution is important for us because a lot of what we know about medicine comes from evolution. We know about antibiotic resistance, over prescription of antibiotics. We can watch how flu mutates. We can watch how COVID-19 mutates. And we can see how those diseases evolve, and then we can treat accordingly. This is huge. Okay. This whole section, these two chapters I'm mushing together, are about biodiversity. Okay. Biodiversity, biological diversity, is the variety of life across all of these levels: species, genes, populations, and communities. Currently, we've got about 2 million species identified, but it could be anywhere between 3 and 100 million species. And it's kind of crazy that it's 2020 and we don't know all of the species that exist on the planet. That's kind of crazy. The process where new species are generated is called speciation. We don't have to go too far beyond that. Life changes constantly, and organisms evolve, and you get new species, but then some species wind up dying out. What you see of a dead organism, if it's preserved, is a fossil. Hard-bodied organisms are more likely to fossilize because, their hard parts will turn to stone rather than like soft-bodied things like sponges and corals, soft corals, and stuff like that. And you look at all the fossils around the world, they call it the fossil record. And this is crazy. The vast majority of species that have ever been alive are now gone as the result of something called extinction. We're going to talk a little bit more about extinction in the next section, in the chapter 11 part. Extinction happens when species just can't keep up. Okay, they can't keep up to the changes in the environment, whether that's because of predation or habitat destruction or anything like that. Okay. This is an important term to know: endemic species. If a species is endemic to a region, they don't exist anywhere else on the planet. So, like the lemurs, right? Lemurs live on Madagascar, right? So lemurs are endemic to Madagascar. So they are very vulnerable because there are no other populations around the planet. So if something severe happens in Madagascar, then all of the lemur species are going to be affected. Okay. Island dwelling species like the birds on Hawaii, like the lemurs in Madagascar, are also at high risk for extinction because they have been isolated for so long and they haven't had to develop and evolve those kinds of survival tactics that many of the mainland organisms have. We have something called a background extinction rate, and we're going to talk about it on the next slide. There have been at least 5 mass extinctions that have wiped out a huge chunk of the Earth's species every time. 50 to 95% of the Earth's species have been wiped out every time there's been a mass extinction. The most recent one was about 250 million years ago. Some of the causes are volcanism, asteroid impact, methane gas releases, and global warming, all of which will change the environment to the point where, if species can't survive in that extreme, they're going to go extinct. This is stunning to me. Today's extinction rate is 100 to 1,000 times higher than the background rate, and it's going up. It's increasing. A lot of it has to do with our existence on the planet. Sorry, guys, my nose itches. We're altering or destroying habitats, overhunting or overharvesting. We're polluting everything. We're introducing non-native species. And then climate change is another huge thing that's causing the extinctions. You guys know this already, what ecology is. We're talking about the interactions among organisms and with their environments. And there's a bunch of levels. The organism is a single living thing. Population is a bunch of individuals. You put a bunch of populations together and you get a community. You can be a community ecologist and you can study how those different species interact. Ecosystems are where you put all of those communities together and combine them with the abiotic or the non-living parts of the environment. And you can be an ecosystem ecologist where you study how energy flows between the living and the non-living parts and how nutrients flow. That is chapter 5, where we talk about biogeochemical cycles. And then you put all of these ecosystems together and you get the biosphere, which is all of the living things and their habitats on the planet. Okay. Every organism on the earth has habitat needs. So they need a place to live, right? So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of habitats. And like this says, depending on the species, the habitat might be a square meter of soil, or it could be hundreds of miles of land, like a bacterial habitat versus like a tiger or an elephant habitat. Different from a habitat is a niche or a niche. Depending on the day, depending on the minute, it could come out of my mouth either way. And then this is how organisms use their resources and they interact with other organisms. Okay. These are two terms that we're going to use, niche specialists and niche generalists. If an organism is really specialized, has a very small role, not a small role, but a very specific role in a community, it's got a specialized niche, right? So there's this, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that one. That bird is really specialized to dig grubs out of trees between the beak and the talons, all that stuff. So it really only has one job. That's all it does. A species that can utilize a wider variety of resources are called generalists. So rats are generalists. Mice, organisms that can, cockroaches are generalists. They can pretty much survive no matter what. We talked, when you guys watch this, you will have done this already. We are going to do some demographic math because that always, shows up on tests and stuff. Demographers study population change, and there are 4 things that you need to know to determine how a population grows or shrinks. Natality is births within the population. Mortality is deaths. Immigration is people coming in. Immigration to a population. And emigration, or different organisms, not just people. Emigration is people leaving or exiting the population. If you're looking at the natural rate of increase, you take the death rate and subtract it from the birth rate. So the natality rate minus the mortality rate. But if you look at the actual population growth rate, we have to include immigration and emigration. And this is going to be an important formula for you. Okay. It's going to be an important formula for you. the actual population growth rate is birth rate minus death rate plus immigration rate minus emigration rate. And then you can do that per 1,000 individuals. And most of the time, growth rates are expressed as percentages, like you saw when we did the population math. So we kind of talked about this when we looked at the human population graph, when we talked about the agricultural and the industrial revolution. When a population goes up by a fixed percentage every year, it undergoes what we call exponential growth. And what you get is a J-shaped curve, right? So if you have 100 organisms, let's say, 100 flowers, and it increases by 10%, it increases by 10% in the first year. So the first year, 100 becomes 110. But then it increases by 10% the following year. So 10% of 110 is 11. So then it becomes 121. And then 10% of 121 is 12. So then it becomes 133. Do you follow? Okay, so what happens is it grows faster and faster as the population gets bigger. So that's why you get this J-shaped curve. All right. It doesn't happen. It can't sustain. Exponential growth can't sustain itself, okay, in a natural environment, because there are these things called limiting factors. Physical, chemical, and biological limiting factors. Things that, there's not enough mates for everybody to mate. There's not enough food. There's not enough water. There's not enough nesting sites. So when that happens, okay, the graph will start picking up, the population size graph will start picking up, and then it'll approach the carrying capacity, and then it'll start to slow down. And there's some examples here. I don't really like the way they did that, so I'm going to add something to this. Hopefully this works. Now let's try this. Okay. So it's not like it just comes up and stops, right? So the population is going to go up. Maybe it's going to work. Okay, the population is going to go. Sorry for the technical difficulties, guys. It's going to go up and down and up and down. Of course, that's not working. It's going to highlight, isn't it? Yeah. So it's going to oscillate. It's going to go back and forth around that carrying capacity. Okay. So what's going to happen is it's going to wind up coming up over the carrying capacity. Resources are going to be tight, be scarce. So when resources are plentiful, we know that the organisms reproduce. So they're going to go over top of that carrying capacity. But then they're going to realize that resources aren't so plentiful. So then they don't reproduce and organisms die off. So then it comes down below the carrying capacity. Once they get below the carrying capacity, resources are going to be plentiful again, so they're going to start reproducing. So what you get is like this snaking around the carrying capacity. So if you average what's above with what's below, what you get is life right here at the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is abbreviated K, just so you guys know. So you might see that somewhere. Why is this not working? All right, whatever. It's all good. What controls the size of a population are these limiting factors. They can either be density dependent, so things that are related to the size and the density of the population, like predation or disease. If you have a lot of organisms living together, you're going to wind up with some kind of a disease. Density independent factors are completely unrelated to the size and the density of the population. So temperature extremes, natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, anything like that. Okay. We can also look at how Different organisms survive out in the world. Um, there are differences, it's called the life history theory, differences in how different species invest in reproduction, parental care, and survival are depicted in things called survivorship curves. Pay attention. Pay attention. So there's the survivorship graph. Okay. If you look at what the graph is saying, it's the number of survivors versus age. Okay. So in the type 3, which are the frogs, you can see here, early on in life, there are lots and lots of organisms, right? So frogs lay oodles and oodles of eggs. We know that. The frog lays all these eggs, but not many of them survive because they don't have parents that care for them. They just kind of lay the eggs and off they go. All right. So the chance of death is a lot higher when you're a young frog than when you are an old frog. Okay. They are also called R-selected species. You need to know that. Type 3 survivorship are R-selected species. They do really well when life is just constantly changing. Okay. Type 1 survivorship is us. We are type 1. Type 1 survivorships are called curves are represented by organisms that are K-selected species. They don't have many offspring at a time, but they definitely invest heavily in their offspring survival. Okay. So here we are. You have a greater chance of survival at a young age when you are like us, a type 1 K-selected species. But as you get older, the population decreases. Okay. The kind that they don't talk about is this type 2 species. You pretty much have an equal chance of dying no matter how old you are. Okay, so that's the type 2 species. There are ways that we can protect biodiversity. It needs to be something that is appealing to people. People need to see value in it. And one way that they're doing that is through something called ecotourism, where they like set their areas up for tourism and that kind of thing. And people want to come and look at it without destroying it. And Hawaii is huge for ecotourism. One of the harder things about maintaining biodiversity is this idea of climate change. So this is kind of interesting. The malaria, okay, exists above the 13 degrees Celsius isotherm. And isotherm, iso means same, therm is temperature. So this white line represents an area of the same temperature. So part of this park, which is in purple, or the wildlife refuge, that's in purple, is above the isotherm. Okay. So they don't have an issue with malaria, but as that isotherm moves up as a result of climate change, more of the park is in that zone where malaria could be. And that has long lasting effects. And that's why malaria and Zika and a lot of those diseases, those tropical diseases, are marching their way up here. West Nile, all that stuff. So that was evolution and biodiversity. Let's look at human impacts on biodiversity. So we're going to take a look at biodiversity on the earth, look at different ways that we can conserve it, look at extinction a little bit deeper, talk about why biodiversity is important to us. This is your case study for this chapter, for this pair of chapters. They were looking at building a road through the Serengeti, and I've got 2 articles, they're really short, that explain why we should and why we shouldn't. Millions, 2 million or more animals migrate across Africa as the seasons change. These are the Maasai people. They are kind of nomadic, and they move with the wildebeest, move with the animals, and have lived in this area for a really long time, and pretty well, pretty sustainably. So here is Serengeti National Park. It's this dark green. Protected areas are around it are in the lighter green. So the people in northern Tanzania are kind of isolated from the rest of the country. So they don't get their resources and that kind of thing. So what winds up happening is poverty is reigning. And the Tanzanian president promised to build a commercial highway, paved highway, right through the Serengeti, right through here, to reconnect the people. So here's the wildebeest movement, right? Here is the migration path. And the road goes right in the middle of the migration path. So they're going to block migration routes with this road. You could have animal car collisions, poachers, the people that go in and just, kill elephants for their ivory and tigers for their skins and all that stuff, would be have a paved highway right into the middle of the Serengeti where all these organisms are. And along the edges of the reserves, you have this highway going through. People will want supplies and gas and comforts going in and then coming out. So they blocked the plan in 2016. The courts did, and before 2016, and then in 2000 and suggested this alternate route. Okay, but then in 2016, a new president was elected, and they said, let's just build an oil pipeline through instead of a road. And that just, reignited the issue. So we know what biodiversity is from our first chapter, the variety of life across all levels of organization. We know what species are. So species diversity is the number of or the variety of species found in a region. So if you look at the species richness, it's the number of species that are in a region. Like the tropical rainforest is really, really rich in species because there's lots of different kinds of species. But then you need to look at the populations of each of those species in that area. So you can say an area has a high species richness if there are lots of different species. But if you look at the number of the populations, right, the number of organisms of each of those species in that area, if you have mostly one kind and very few organisms of all the rest, that's not a very even distribution of your species, right? So the best biodiversity has high species richness and high species evenness, right? There are lots and lots of individuals of all of these different species, okay? Genetic diversity is within a species. So you have lots of different individuals who are not inbred, they're not related. They have lots of mutations and variation, which allows them to survive and reproduce and continue the species. And then ecosystem diversity talks about all of the ecosystems, communities, and habitats on the earth. The more you have, the more diverse it is. So if you have high genetic diversity, high species diversity in terms of richness and evenness, and high ecosystem diversity, it's like perfect. And biodiversity is uneven, okay? So most of the species on the earth are animals. Of those animal species, most of them are insects. Ugh. But that's okay, because we need them. And then most of the vertebrates, which is this little tiny sliver, the smallest sliver of the animals, most of the vertebrates are fish. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. Biodiversity is also based on location. So if you think about the areas that are the most biodiverse, they're more towards the equator. Okay. And if you look at it, it's the technical term that you don't have to know is latitudinal gradient in species richness. As you move away from the equator, species richness decreases. Okay. And these are the reasons why the equator is like the perfect place to be. Yeah, definitely no glaciation at the equator. Okay. And if you have areas that are more diverse in terms of habitats, or the areas are more structurally diverse, like forests, the canopy, the underbrush, the mid layer of the canopy, that kind of thing. You're going to have more biodiversity. Here's a picture, a map. These are the number of bird species at a particular latitude. So you can see, like, down in Costa Rica, I forget what was north of Panama, Costa Rica, 600 to almost 700 bird species in that area. Whereas, like, up in northern Canada, you got 30. All right. And we kind of talked about why. We talked about this. We don't know. One of the reasons why we don't know how many different species there are is because a lot of them are tiny and small. We're not going to go digging and looking for like roundworms. Okay. Okay. Why is biodiversity important for us? What is the big deal, Mrs. Grady? Why do we have to keep it? All right. So the first thing is we could develop new or unused food sources. So we get wild relatives of lots of crops. If we interbreed the wild relatives with these species that we have currently, we could fight disease. We're going to talk about monocropping when we get to agriculture, and monocropping is an issue. So just in Central and South America, these are some potential food species that we could use. Okay, if we have a hard time feeding our population, we kind of have to think outside the box. Amaranth is something that is pretty well used now. I see it in quite a bunch of places. Capybara, do you know capybara was the world's largest rodent? And you can raise it, you can ranch it, which is kind of crazy. Okay, and some other choices that if we really had a food security issue, we could use these. So that's food sources we need to eat. You get lots of drugs and medicine from a lot of chemical compounds in wild plants. All right, where's the one? Taxol. Okay, my mom had a very aggressive lung cancer. And it was really aggressive. It was stage 4 non-small cell adenocarcinoma. And she was on Taxol, paclitaxel. And it was in clinical trials for lung cancer because it was originally prescribed for prostate cancer because prostate cancer tends to spread so fast. But she was in clinical trials for it. And if it wasn't for, the existence of the Pacific U, she wouldn't have hung around for as long as she did. So a lot of what we use, these wild plants for pharmaceutical reasons, we need these plants in place. You could be a bioprospector. You could go and look for organisms that could have some really good prospects when it comes to medicines and foods or anything like that. The horseshoe crabs have been really, said to have a lot of medicinal properties, and that's just some of the research that they're doing. So food, medicine, two big things why we need them. Oh my gosh, back to ecosystem services. Yes. The more diversity we have in an ecosystem, the more that ecosystem can do, because the better functioning that ecosystem is. And remember, ecosystem services, we need ecosystem services to do all of these things for us. And the quality of ecosystem services is directly connected to the health of the ecosystem. And more biodiverse ecosystems are healthier than those that are less biodiverse. So we hit all four here, right? The partitioning, the regulating, and all of those, okay? So that's why biodiversity is important. And it also maintains ecosystem function. And we'll talk a little bit more about the resilience of an ecosystem. The more biodiversity you have in an ecosystem, the better it is when it comes to being resilient against change, okay? If it withstands disturbance, if it comes back pretty quickly, or if it adapts to changes, if those changes are slow, it's a resilient ecosystem. And we need resilient ecosystems. You need to know about keystone species. Think about a keystone like in an arch. The keystone is the stone at the top that holds the whole arch together. So in the case of a keystone species, if you pull that keystone species out from extinction, right? If you pull the keystone out of the arch, the whole arch falls apart. The whole food chain ecosystem beneath that keystone species falls apart. And we're going to talk about that, I think, in chapter 4. There are ecosystem engineers, like beavers are ecosystem engineers. And this is interesting about the elephants. So elephants are an endangered species. If you pull elephants out of the savanna, the grasslands in Africa, they can't stay grasslands anymore. They wind up turning into scrub forest because the elephants are not pounding down that ground and tramping over it. And when they do trample all over it, they don't let the seedlings grow, the scrubby vegetation grow. So you take those elephants out, the flora changes and it becomes a different ecosystem. The idea of ecotourism, can boost local economies. It gives people jobs. Okay. So this is something, if like somebody asks you for, like an economic benefit of biodiversity, you can say this. Okay. This is that idea, of biophilia that we talked about. As humans, we love nature and we love living things, whether it's a plant or an animal. We love being outside in nature. And that's biophilia, okay? I wouldn't be getting too close to that flower if I was that lady. It's interesting, but that's the one that smells like rotting meat. So I wouldn't be that close to it, but that's just me. He also, Norton suggested that if we're not out in nature, if we don't spend enough time outside, it can cause anxiety and stress. And I totally believe that. Just for myself, I know how I feel when I walk out on that first crisp fall day, kind of like it is outside right now. The sky is really blue, the air is crisp, and I just go, bring it on, world. Whatever you got, just bring it on. It's just good stuff. I also feel that the last day of school, or the very first really nice spring day, when it's been really cold, right? And you got your jacket and your boots, and it was freezing in the morning, and you walk out and it's just beautiful. The sun is shining. There's a nice little breeze and the air is just perfect. So I believe that for sure. As far as biodiversity goes, as ecosystems change, there are organisms that can keep up, and then there are organisms that can't, both in the plant world and the animal world. We, as a human species, we're taking all of the differences in these little ecosystems and kind of making them uniform, right? So instead of an open field of grass, natural grass, and a forest, we kind of like turn it all to farm fields or something like that. When that happens, that kind of situation favors generalists rather than the specialists that we talked about before, right? It favors those organisms that can pretty much adapt to anything rather than those organisms that have a specific, requirement for their lives. Okay. Organisms that benefit from development are faster producing, they're lower on the food chain. So if we look at this in terms of K and R species, okay, if we look at this in terms of K and R species, this I know will work. Maybe. There we go. The winners tend to be our R selected or generalists, and our losers tend to be our K selected. So it's sad that the tiger is going to lose. Oh, it says it right there. Good. I'm glad I remembered. Right. So the R selected species are the ones that are more likely to be generalists. They're going to survive no matter what. The K selected species are less likely to survive. Okay. Populations are shrinking. You know, we're getting smaller and smaller populations. So what winds up happening is that genetic diversity decreases too. So you have a greater chance of inbreeding, and with more inbreeding, you know, the species is not going to survive. And species on populations are, as they shrink, they generally are restricted to a smaller area. So that way inbreeding is more likely to happen. Okay, so we've got two terms to talk about here: extinction and extirpation. All right. Extinction is when the last member of a species dies and there are no more of that species on the planet. It is gone. It ceases to exist. Okay. Extirpation is the loss of a species from one particular area, but not the whole world. All right. So if you look at this picture map thing on the living area of the black rhino. So the black rhino was all in sub-Saharan Africa and all in Eastern Africa and partially in coastal Western Africa too. Okay. That's the orange. Where it is now is the red. So you can say that the black rhino has been extirpated from northern sub-Saharan Africa, right? And from central Africa, southern Central Africa. But we can't say it's extinct because it has pockets where it still exists. That's an important term, two important terms to understand the difference between. Extinction and extirpation, they are natural processes, but we're making it go faster. It's going a lot faster than 1 out of every 1 to 10 million mammal and marine animals are going extinct every year. There have been 5 mass extinction events. We talked about them. And there's a lot of evidence that says we are in the middle of the 6th extinction due to human impacts. They're looking at changing our geological time period to the Anthropocene from the Holocene because of how drastically we've altered ecosystems and biodiversity. Okay. We talked about that too. And there's a really good book called The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert that you guys might want to read. It's a really good read. I read it on the beach in Punta Cana a couple summers ago. And it was really, really good. It's nonfiction, obviously, but it's like really well-written nonfiction. Okay. So several majors, you need to know this. The causes of biodiversity loss. Habitat loss is the big one. Okay. We are altering habitat at an alarming rate to build, development, to change it from natural areas to areas for agriculture, farming, and grazing. We're damming rivers at an alarming rate. When that happens, it's not like somebody comes in and like clear cuts the entire rainforest. What normally winds up happening is like the habitat loss happens in little bits. It's called habitat fragmentation. So this is what would have happened if they put the road in the Serengeti. It would have divided the northern part of the park from the southern part of the park. So here's your original habitat. And say this is a farmer's field right here. And this is another farmer's field. And this is, the open area for a village. Okay. Then that fragmentation keeps happening and keeps happening and keeps happening. So those gaps between the natural areas get wider. Okay. And then here at this point, any species that needed this whole area to survive doesn't have it anymore. So the species winds up disappearing. Tigers are a really good example of that. Tigers require, many square miles of land as territory. And one of the reasons why tigers are endangered is because of habitat fragmentation. People are taking little chunks and little chunks and little chunks out of the tiger's natural ecosystem. And when that happens, they can't hunt. They don't have enough places to sleep. So they die or they leave. Habitat loss is the biggest issue when it comes to the loss of biodiversity. Pollution is harmful too. Okay, lots of things that we can look at for pollution. Plastic pollution in the ocean, persistent pollutants, okay, like what we had in our water, air pollution, noise and light pollution, right? Lots and lots of things. We'll talk about agricultural runoff too. It's called eutrophication, one of my favorite things that we talk about. Okay. Because our population is getting bigger, but more importantly, because our consumption is going up, we are getting rid of species at a very alarming rate, faster than they can reproduce. So teak and mahogany from the rainforest, they're disappearing quickly. Teak and mahogany, when I was in high school, that was the big thing, like destroying the Amazon rainforest, deforestation, all that stuff. But now teak and mahogany, for the most part, are farmed. So they're sustainably grown. You're not destroying more of the natural ecosystem. We're going to talk about overfishing, okay? Killing of sharks, killing gorillas for bush meat. We're going to spend a lot of time in the next chapter talking about invasive species. They're non-native. And they can take off like gangbusters. We know of 2 right now in Hunterdon County. And there's one, the emerald ash borer. I have 3 trees right at the end of my driveway that have been destroyed by the emerald ash borer. So now I got to take them down, because if they fall down, they're going to take out the road. They can cross my driveway, take out the power lines, anything like that. And the one we know now is the spotted lanternfly. Definitely a disgusting thing. Species that are native to islands tend to be more vulnerable to invasive species because they are so specialized, because they are niche specialists, okay? When I got my master's degree, I went through Mississippi State, and when we talked about invasive species in my environmental science class, we talked about kudzu. And it covers everything down there. All of the trees, all of the bushes, everything is covered in kudzu. So my environmental science teacher talked about kudzu, but he was from Mississippi, so he said kudzu. It's kind of funny. Climate change is also hurting biodiversity, okay? It's not so bad for tropical organisms. I mean, it's bad it's bad everywhere. Okay. But the worst part about it is that you have organisms that live in the tropics. If they live in the tropics and it's too warm, they can change their latitude. So they can keep moving further north and north and north, or south and south, depending on which side of the equator they're on. Or they can change their latitude. They can go up the side of the mountain. But if you have organisms that are living at the poles, or organisms that are already living at high altitude, if it gets warm there, they have no place to go. All right. And they're super vulnerable. And there's a polar bear, and it makes me sad. But we have a solution, and it's the field of conservation biology. You can go to college and you can major in conservation biology. And you can look at biodiversity and how it's being affected in a particular area. And you can study it and you can do something about it. I think that if I wasn't so into volcanoes and now teaching, conservation biology would be something I would be totally into, to do my part to preserve what's going on in the world. You can look at genetics, right? If we're talking about inbreeding, you can look, and I think this is probably what they were doing with the Seychelles magpie robin here, drawing a blood sample to look at genetic variation, to look at how to give more attention to those small, vulnerable populations that are at a greater risk of extinction. Okay. So these are our first, the next couple of slides are our first pieces of legislation that you guys need to know. Okay. One is the Endangered Species Act, 1973. Two categories of protection. One is an endangered species. So they're in danger of becoming extinct in the near future. And then is threatened. So threatened and endangered species are both protected under the Endangered Species Act. Okay. The ESA is how we abbreviate it, prevents the government, not just citizens, but the government and citizens from doing things that destroy individuals within a species. Okay. One of the biggest successes of the Endangered Species Act is the recovery of the bald eagle and other birds as the result of DDT. And we're going to talk about DDT down the line when we talk about biomagnification. I've got a crazy trailer to show you. It's going to blow your minds. Federal authorization for government money for the ESA expired in 1992, and it hasn't been reauthorized. So since 1992, which is essentially as long as I've been out of high school, a lot of species that have been in need of protection haven't gotten that protection. Some people say that the big criticism of the Endangered Species Act is that it prevents business and industry from doing its thing. And back when I was in high school, there was a northern spotted owl. You know, the big thing was, they're logging in the Pacific Northwest, but they're endangering, they're going to make this northern spotted owl go extinct. And it's not that way, because the Endangered Species Act gives the government and citizens workarounds to preserve the species, but do other things so that their livelihood isn't jeopardized. Okay. And this is what they're talking about. So the Endangered Species Act is an American thing. The Endangered Species Act is an American thing. Okay. The other one we're going to talk about, I'll get back to it, is CITES. Okay. Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. You can just call it CITES. Okay. It's the international transport of the body parts of rare species. So the ivory ban, right, is part of CITES. The Convention on Biological Diversity kind of gives money to developing countries to give them incentive to not destroy their natural spaces. And then there are some successes of that. Something else that they're doing, and you guys have probably heard about this, is captive breeding, where they will take endangered individuals, they'll breed them in captivity, and then reintroduce the offspring into the wild. And this makes me sad. There are 65 plant and animal species now that exist only in captivity, not in the natural world. And that makes me sad. I remember this very well from when I was in high school. The California condor is one of the biggest success stories from a captive breeding program. There were 22 of them in 1982. They were hunted and they were shot with lead shot, so they were poisoned, lead poisoned. There were 22 of them left in 1982, and they started captive breeding programs, and it's gotten a lot better since then. I remember seeing videos of the people, the conservationists, taking care of these baby condors, but they weren't like hand feeding the baby condor with their hands. They put a mask on, like a condor parent, adult condor mask, and they were like feeding the baby that way. So that's biodiversity. We'll talk about a couple things when we get together after you guys have watched this. But those are the big ideas.